Hello and welcome to the Lockdown LitFest and in particular to this event. Today we are talking poetry. My name is Julia Wheeler and it's my huge pleasure to welcome to Lockdown Lit the poet Martha Sprackland. Welcome, Martha. And indeed to talk to her about her first collection, which is called Citadel. Martha, I wonder if you'd mind holding up the copy of your book.
That's
beautiful there in orange, and I have to say it's the deep Lockdown Lit that we both obviously know, and we're all kind of on that as part of your launch.
flawless, yeah.
So it was due to be launched at the end of April. It's been locked down. What did you have planned? What have you managed to do in terms of the launch? And has it made you more creative?
Gosh, I think in some ways, yes, certainly. So the idea originally was to have a launch up in Liverpool, where the publisher, Liverpool University Press or Pavilion Poetry, is based. And obviously it's a great shame not to have been able to go back up north and launch it there, where a good chunk of the book is set, really, on that coast. But it did mean that I was able to do a little launch on Zoom for Desperate Literature, the bookshop in Madrid, where I've lived from time to time, where I wrote lots of the poems, and that felt sort of appropriate and special enough.
It's interesting the phrase you used, that the book is largely set there. I mean, I think we think perhaps more generally in as novels or short stories being set somewhere. Is that a phrase that poets use about their poetry?
Gosh, well, perhaps not. I'm aware that this book, Citadel, is not quite the book that I set out to write. If a writer can say they set out to write a book in any sense, I feel that collections, particularly first collections, often divide into two camps. You know, there's the rattlebag, a selection of the poet's best work to date, and then there's the concept album, which contains a much more linear, perhaps, narrative, or something more novelistic, something closer to a story. And I hadn't set out to do that at all until these poems coalesced around the story that they did. So it feels unusual, but perhaps appropriate to say that it's set in Madrid and in Merseyside. That's certainly how I feel it unfolds, that these poems are located very strongly in these two places that have been very important to me.
So when you were putting this collection together, I noticed that there are a couple of poems from previous pamphlets. How long ago did you write the first ones? How linear, if you like, and perhaps you talk a little bit about the process of drawing those together and fitting them within this concept.
Sure. It was a bit stop and start, I think I'd say. I've been writing for a long time, you know, more than 2 decades, and I've taken a really slow, I think, and circuitous route to a debut collection. And that was partly anxiety, I think, you know, a fear of getting it wrong, of publishing something that I wouldn't be pleased with in a couple of years. But also partly it was that the subject matter I found myself writing about was difficult, you know, was personal and uncomfortable. And those two first pamphlets, one in 2017 called Glass is Broken Glass, and one the following year, 2018, called Milktooth, they both, I think, took the first tentative steps towards telling stories, or a collection of stories that I was finding uncomfortable and that I was finding painful. So the poems, the few poems that have carried over from the pamphlet Milktooth into Citadel, into the full-length collection, are, a sort of leftover, really, a sort of hand holding. You know, in order to write the full collection, I needed to have the support of that previous pamphlet to move forward into the next thing. Unfortunately for my editor, Darren, the manuscript that I finally deemed finished, that I finally came up with about a year ago, was not the manuscript that she had accepted and that we'd signed a contract based on. You know, having the validation of knowing that a book was coming out, I think I accessed a completely different set of ideas, or a completely different set of approaches, and suddenly found last May in Madrid that I was able to write about all those things that had been a blockage for so long, that had been causing me so much trouble. So I finally had to submit this completely different manuscript, really focusing around a completely different story. So it's been a slightly winding road, I think. Not as straightforward, I don't think, as my editor would have liked.
But equally, once you've discovered that different way, in order to be true to yourself, sure, you can't go back, can you?
I certainly felt that I couldn't go back. I allowed some things back in. I allowed some older poems that Darren rightly pointed out did share something important with the new poems back into the manuscript. Before speaking to Darren, I'd been very dogmatic about keeping them separate. You know, that was the old story, and this is the new story, and this is the one I want to tell. This is what I want to be writing about. But I think Darren's right. You know, you can't quite sever one era of your own writing from what came before it. You know, it's too intertwined. It's too enmeshed with what came before. And you know, this book is not. It's probably not an easy book. It's quite resistant in some ways, I think, to the reader. It's a little bit closed off. And I think having these few poems that link back, they provide a key in some ways to reading some of the more resistant poems. So yes, perhaps you can't go back, but you can look back, I think, and take things from what's gone before to inform what happens now.
And the perfect title, The Citadel, if some of these poems are closed off, if you like. I should say, I'm sure anybody listening is going to be intrigued as to exactly what this book is about, and we will get to that. But I must first of all just say the reviews have been fantastic, haven't they? You're being very modest. The reviews have said the images are electrifying. This is a fierce and fresh debut that rings with courage and intelligence. So congratulations. So now just give us the sort of the setting, the idea, the concept of this collection.
Sure, I will try my best. So in short, this is a book of poems that is written from the point of view of an I, from the narrator, who is a composite of two women, one of whom is a contemporary poet, some version of me, some version of the poet, and the other voice belongs to some fictionalized version of Juana la Loca, or Joanna the Mad, who was a 16th century monarch of Spain, a woman who I've been sort of obsessed with for a long time. Her life has always been a touchstone in some inscrutable, intangible sort of way. She was the daughter of the instigators of the Spanish Inquisition, and you know, had a brutal and strange life, partly as a result of that. The tortures that she underwent, sort of in the name of discipline and in the name of controlling and directing her faith, her Catholicism, matched in some ways the victims of the Spanish Inquisition. You know, they underwent some of the same physical tortures. But you know, her trials didn't end there, really. You know, she married a Habsburg, Philip the Handsome, and he, along with Juana's father and Juana's son, over the years conspired against her and had her confined ultimately at Tordesillas, had her locked up for the majority of her life. She lived for an incredibly long time, given the age. You know, she lived into her 70s, but the majority of that life was spent in confinement. And she's most famous, I think, for this particular scene in her life, this particular misery in her life, when Felipe, her husband, died, perhaps by poisoning. She was driven to distraction by the fact of his grief. She loved him very much, although he was such a cad, really. And she wouldn't allow his body to be buried. She was certain that he'd wake up, you know, that he would come back. And there are two very striking paintings in the Prado, in the museum in Madrid, in the gallery in Madrid, that show Juana, you know, in this landscape of despair, and her husband's coffin laid out in front of her. But there was a lot more to her life, of course. You know, I'm more interested in what wasn't said and what wasn't left behind. We don't have anything really of her own writing. She had a little book of days, and there was talk of some letters, but really everything's been lost, though she's voiceless. And I was interested in that. I'm interested in her voicelessness and different kinds of voicelessness. I was feeling that I couldn't write about certain things, and I felt that she didn't have the opportunity to write about certain things, and that perhaps if we could communicate in some way, we could both move past some element of difficulty or blockage. And of course, it's all symbolic. You know, I don't expect that. I know that the version of Juana in this book isn't real, but then the I in the book isn't me either. You know, this is fictionalized. So the poems employ a sort of portal through which these two fictionalized women can communicate and write and heal and help each other in various ways. When I put it like that, it sounds it sounds more complicated than I hope it is.
No, it doesn't sound complicated. I think you've explained that beautifully. I wonder whether we might hear one of the poems from early on in the book, A Blow to the Head, which is, well, let's read it and then we'll talk about it. If you can, sure.
A blow to the head. Enough to knock the earth from its orbit. Oh, I was cracked open. God streaming like daylight into the chamber. The nausea of my elliptical swerve towards consciousness and away again. I retreated into the Citadel, walked quiet pathways during the bombardment, which was habit forming. I was fortified. Knew that beyond the wall something was spilling, blood or yolk onto tile. I made my way to the innermost room. My hand was the key. Found her strung like a diver, eyes shut, calm. And before the old world dragged me back, I loosed the cord from her wrist, woke back into a different time with the end of it in my hand.
Thank you. I guess my question is, what parallels do you see between your life and her life that persuaded you that you wanted to be in this woman's company for as long as it takes to write a poetry collection?
Gosh, I suppose on the face of it, there aren't strong parallels between my life and hers, and I think that's important in a way. I don't want to appropriate anything of her story. You know, her life was very hard, but the sense of confinement, of being shut up or trapped, I think is what struck me first of her story, and particularly in this poem, the citadel that the speaker of this poem finds herself walking is a fortress. You know, it's a place of protection, a place of safety, a place capable of withstanding bombardment, siege, but it's also, in its way, you know, a prison. And I think the way that I relate to that image, the way that I think of the citadel throughout the book, really is about trauma and anxiety, and the long effects of trauma. That in order to survive things, whatever they may be, there can be the need to retreat behind a wall and to alter the way a person approaches the world, to alter what she lets in and what she lets out, to create a strong barricade against the world. And that has its positives and its negatives. And I think having struggled with anxiety and obsessive compulsive problems and trauma, the after effects of trauma, of pain, for a long time, I'm very interested in this idea of the wall breaking down, you know, of the boundaries falling away, and some version of communication passing across what was there before. And in this particular poem, which begins with an image from my real life, from my actual life, which was a blow to the head, a not terribly serious one, I have to say, but one that, in the imagining of this book, is capable of knocking through the wall of time and making communication with this 16th century queen possible. I wonder if that explains it at all.
Yes, it does. It absolutely does. This makes, by sharing these views both within your poetry and in what you're talking about today, it potentially makes you as a person very vulnerable. You're being very honest. You said, you know, partly autobiographical. I wonder, when you're writing, how much of that, when you're first getting it down on the page, actually appears in the final version, if you like, or do you in some ways get that down, get it out? It allows you to explore your world, of course, but then actually perhaps you pull back from that, or your editor pulls back from that.
I think it's the former, if it's either of those. When I first write a poem in first draft, I often find that it doesn't go far enough. It doesn't go as far as I would like it to go. It doesn't say the thing that it could boldly say. And I have to push myself quite hard, I think. I have to be a little rough with myself going into second, third, fourth draft to really pull out the thing that the poem is offering to express. You know, I don't think it's cowardice not to write personal poems at all. You know, I don't think there's any obligation to be confessional. I don't think there's any obligation for the eye of the poem to be the eye of the person, the eye of the poet. And I don't always want to write about myself and my own life, and I don't always do that. But when I do want to, I want to go as far as I can possibly go. And I don't think I've done that in Citadel at all, really. You know, this is a first opening up. This is a first go at being bold, I think, at being honest about the self of the poet. I think when I struggle to sort of bring out those personal stories that I want to write about, I think about Edna O'Brien has this wonderful quote. She says something like, "The one thing that a writer must never do is withdraw." And so when I'm feeling embarrassed or uncomfortable or frightened about writing something of my life into a poem, I focus on that, and I take a deep breath, and I pull it out like a splinter or a tooth. But it doesn't necessarily come easily to me. It doesn't necessarily feel cathartic. And I don't think I have an immediate urge to divulge or to confess, but I think that's what makes it more valuable to me, in a way that it has to be drawn out, that it's hard won. Feels better. It feels more valuable to me.
You are also an editor. You edit other people's poetry. You were at Faber and Faber for a long time. You have started Cake magazine and other projects online and in magazine form. Perhaps you could talk to us a little bit about the different brains, if you like, from being a poet, writing poetry, and then having also to edit other people's poetry, because they are different bits of a way of thinking, aren't they?
For sure, yeah. And I'm aware of that every time I try to edit one of my own poems, which I'm not good at. I'm not good at it at all. I find that I can more easily approach a sort of bliss when editing somebody else's work. You know, there's an excitement for me in editing somebody else's poem and seeing how it could just be slightly turned to a different angle, slightly turned towards the light to work better. I think I attain a sort of deep focus when I'm doing that sort of work. When I'm editing my own poems, I'm petulant and frustrated, and it takes a long time, and it feels much more like the necessary homework of poetry. And I don't know why it's so much more difficult to do that. I don't know. I've never known. But it's something that I'm still having to learn. I don't think I'm a bad editor, not to toot my own horn, but I think I'm quite good at it. And it's been so difficult to apply that same rigor to my own work that I have to be oddly strict about it. I have this document of editorial processes and prompts that I rarely have to use now when editing other people's work or when teaching. But I do almost religiously. I go through almost step by step in editing my own work. I need to know that it's gone through that same rigorous process that I would put other people's work through. Perhaps it's just that I'm softer on myself than I am on other people.
That's often the way of editors, isn't it? I think. Let's talk a little bit about form. There's a poem in the book called Lullaby, which is single words of places placed very particularly on the page. Just tell us about the thinking behind that, what we might take away from those places, and the way that they are arranged on the page with a lot of white space between them.
Sure. So that's I'm going to flick to it so that I can perhaps hold it up to the camera and see what you're talking about here. It's set out this way. So these places are the names of areas of the shipping forecast in Spanish. So they are regions of sea beginning in Grand Sol, in the sort of between France and England and Spain, that Bay of Biscay, and slightly further south, and tumbling down the French south coast and down the coast of Spain and Portugal, down towards North Africa. And I've long been obsessed with the shipping forecast in English. When I was a child, you know, the sound of it coming on used to sound like a lullaby to me. I don't know if it was the time of day or night that it played, or something in the litany of place names that sounded even then like a poem to me. There was repetition and specialist language. It sounded like an incantation. And so that's always been musically, I think, a part of my poetry speaking brain. And so was delighted to discover when I was living in Spain that the shipping forecast has other names. The litany is different. The specialist language is different. So I wanted, part of this book, part of Citadel, is about falling asleep and waking up. You know, it's about crossing boundaries, about communicating across boundaries, as I've said, and sometimes that boundary is one of sleep. You know, things can happen, things can be said, things can be approached in dreams that can't be approached in waking life. I wanted to explore the way that Felipe, Juana's husband, falls asleep, perhaps is only sleeping rather than dead, and thereby communication is still possible. So various men fall asleep in this book and are soothed to sleep in a way that is loving and not entirely loving, caring and not entirely benevolent. And the shipping forecast itself recurs, these place names recur in the childhood of the northwest coast of England, and occasionally caught in snatches of sound from an unplugged radio in another poem. So I wanted to include these place names so as to have touchstones, specialist language, little words that could provide links between one place and the next.
Beautifully done. I think the only one I recognised was Finisterre, but
yeah, beautiful word, irresistible, really.
You won your first poetry competition when you were 11, and you've said that actually that early recognition was really important, and that it is very important for new poets to have that confidence boost. What did it do for you winning that competition? Tell us about the prize and what it enabled for you.
Sure. I think the winning, of course, at that age feels incredible. I can't deny that, but I think the real effect of it, the real profound effect of it was the prize, which was a week-long residential writing retreat at Lumbank through the Arvon Foundation. And I'm not sure that they send the 11-year-olds on that residential week nowadays. And I'm very lucky that they still did back then, because it was completely life-changing to spend a week living with and eating with and speaking with these impossibly glamorous and intelligent teenagers who were, it was unthinkable to me, really. None of my friends were interested in poetry. My mum is a poet, so I had read some of her poems at home, I'm sure. But on this week, poetry was cool, you know. We did writing workshops together. I was introduced to incredible poets like Sharon Olds and Kieran Carson, by these teenagers who were already steeped in this stuff. You know, they already loved poetry, and I'd never taken it as seriously as I did then. I don't think, you know, I was hooked. I was absolutely captivated by those late nights talking about poetry and those first editorial sessions with the tutors. I think it made what had been something enjoyable to me, writing poems, but quite isolated. You know, I wouldn't speak about writing poems with my friends, to suddenly something that I knew I wanted to spend my life doing, you know, and that I could spend my life doing. So in that way, it feels like that was the fulcrum. That was the real life changer for me.
And I get the sense, both from your the work that you do, your poems, and some of the journalism that you've done, that collaboration is really important to you. Do you think that is something relatively new for your generation of poets in comparison to those of the past?
Yes, I think so. I mean, there have always been, you know, literary circles. There have always been literary groupings, and poets have always had an impact on each other's work, you know, whether that's by editing each other's work, or by providing a space for each other to write in, or simply being an influence on each other's work, whatever that may be. But I think the rise of the literary workshop perhaps has created an environment in which we're all very used to sitting down together and providing direct feedback on each other's work. And, you know, that has a place, it has a use. I think, you know, it's difficult. What matters is to have a group that you trust. I think too much emphasis can be placed on peer feedback as well. You know, you can ask 10 people for feedback and be pulled in 10 different directions, but to have a small, intimate workshop group whose advice you are willing to take, I think can be hugely valuable, particularly to a poet who is just beginning to write and needs encouragement more than they need solitude. I think it matters hugely. I've always been part of a workshop group, a little bit at university, you know, some writing seminars, but mostly with my peer groups. I'm part of a little workshop group now that we're doing by Zoom. In fact, we have one later today. And Roddy Lumsden's Wednesday group was hugely influential to me a few years ago. So yeah, I think gathering a group of trusted friends to provide feedback on your work is important, and perhaps more common now than it was in the past.
And we should say that your collection you've dedicated to Roddy Lumsden, haven't you?
That's right. Yeah. He died earlier this year, sadly, and he was a champion for many emerging poets. You know, he edited their work, he selected them for anthologies, he published their books, edited their books in some cases, and ran this very influential workshop group where a lot of us met. You know, a lot of poets. The scene sort of coalesced around him, and I'm certain that my work wouldn't have the confidence that I hope it does today if it weren't for him and his influence. He brought a lot of poets to my attention that I wouldn't otherwise have heard of, and just sort of provided a space, again, a little like that first Arvon week. You know, he provided a space where poetry was the pin that held together this social group. You know, it was something we all loved, and he, for a long time, was at the heart of that.
So what's next for you, Martha? And do you have a route planned out? Do you have particular ambitions that you want to achieve, or is it very much year at a time, day at a time? To be honest, at the moment, an hour at a time.
Right now, I mean, a minute at a time. Very hard to make plans at the moment. The future is a little unknowable. At the moment, I'm not writing as much poetry as I normally would be. I think there's something about having just had a book out that stops. I don't know. That makes it difficult. Makes it difficult to write new work. I haven't quite broken into whatever new room my poetry will be in when I start writing again. That will come back, though. You know, I used to panic at these fallow periods, and I used to call it writer's block. You know, the poetry wasn't coming, and actually, it always does. It always comes back, and the more I push at it, the more difficult it gets, the more frustrated I get, and that's not conducive to good work. So I'm going slow, and I'm waiting to see what comes, and I'm using that time to read more than I ever have, and hoping to do a little bit more work in translation going forwards. I've done some translation from the Arabic and translation from Spanish, and hoping to do a little more of that. But otherwise, I don't know. It's wide open, really.
Well, that's wonderful that it is so wide open, and I think you're absolutely right. It's a lot of life at the moment is about trusting the process, and you know, using your experience to know that this too shall pass, as it were. I'm going to ask you to read another poem, if I may, and I wonder whether Juana and Martha in therapy might be the one to finish with. But before I do that, I'd really like to say thank you so much for being here. It's opened up a whole new line of thinking for me, and I'm sure for many of the people watching and listening. So thanks so much for being here. Citadel is available now. Please do buy that at your local bookshop. Please support local bookshops and so on. If you've enjoyed this conversation, there are many more on the Lockdown LitFest site, so do please come back and see those. If you have enjoyed it and are minded to donate, that would be wonderful. We're all about the authors at Lockdown LitFest, so that would be hugely appreciated by the team behind this project. So Martha, I'm going to ask you then to read this final poem for us, if you would.
Juana and Martha in therapy. This is what they have learned. Their putative son imprisons them, calls them mad, instructs the wardens to hurt and hold them. Some days he doesn't exist at all, and they're free to go out, to go into the centre of town without a pram, to read books and eat a saucer of olives. The sun is too big for a pram, surely, is almost a man. Time is complicated, especially at these distances. The crackling string of this makeshift telephone between two empty tins of cocido stretches 5 centuries and is desperate to forget. But they too must stay on the line, must work together if they are to escape and write this. They are in the bland room above the Pret at Bishopgate, trying to understand. The walls of the mind are deep and moated. They had 6 children in 9 years. They have no children.
Martha Sprackland, thank you so much. Citadel is the book. Buy it. It's wonderful.